Sherlock Holmes and the Dead Man in Cabin 7, a mystery in the classic tradition of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, narrated in the manner of Dr. John H. Watson, M.D. Chapter 1. The Midnight Telegraph, in which an impossible death upon a moving train sets the stage for the most perplexing case of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It was during the bitter February of 1895 that I first heard the name of the Northfield Express, not as a traveller might hear it, spoken with the casual indifference of one who merely wishes to reach his destination, but rather in the breathless, almost frightened tones of Inspector Clarence Hargrove of Scotland Yard, who arrived at our Baker Street rooms at 11:30 on a Thursday evening, with sleet upon his coat and desperation in his eyes. Holmes was at that hour engaged in one of his more peculiar experiments, having spent the better part of the afternoon subjecting various samples of tobacco ash to an analysis involving hydrochloric acid and a series of glass slides arranged upon our mantelpiece with the precision of a military installation. I had given up attempting to read my evening paper some hours previously, the combined effect of chemical fumes and Holmes's occasional exclamations having rendered concentration quite impossible. I had settled instead for watching the fire and thinking idly of my former medical practice, wondering whether old Anstruther might need an assistant again come spring, when Mrs. Hudson's knock and the announcement of Inspector Hargrove interrupted my reverie. Hargrove was a compact, serious man of perhaps 45, with a neat moustache that he had a habit of touching when uncertain, which was, I was to discover, rather frequently. He was not one of the regulars who sought Holmes's assistance. That honour belonged chiefly to Lestrade and Gregson, and his presence at so late an hour suggested that whatever had driven him to Baker Street had done so with considerable urgency. "Mr. Holmes," he said, before he had fully crossed the threshold, "I apologise for the hour. I would not have come were the matter not extraordinary." Holmes had not looked up from his slides. "The matter concerns a death aboard the Northfield Express," he said, with the mild tone of a man commenting upon the weather. "The victim is male, most likely a gentleman of some standing, and the death occurred, or was discovered, within the last 3 hours. You have come directly from King's Cross, if the particular shade of soot upon your left cuff is any indication. Come in, Hargrove, and tell me what your own eyes have seen, rather than what your sergeants have told you second-hand." The inspector stood momentarily arrested in the doorway, his hand halfway to his moustache. Then he stepped fully inside, removed his hat, and dropped into the chair across from me with the manner of a man surrendering to forces beyond his understanding. "It is a death, yes," he confirmed. "A Mr. Cornelius Ashworth, found dead in cabin 7 of the sleeping car on the 9:15 from Edinburgh to London. The train arrived at King's Cross at 11:03. The body was discovered by the sleeping car attendant, a man named Pruitt, at approximately 10:40, when the train was somewhere between Peterborough and Huntingdon." "And the cause of death?" I asked. My still aboard," said Hargrove, rising. "I ordered the sleeping car sealed pending your arrival. I had hoped you might—" "You hoped correctly," said Holmes. "One moment." He went to his desk and took up a small leather case that I recognized as containing his magnifying glass, his forceps, and the other tools of his investigative trade. Then he paused, and I saw him pick up something else. A slim pamphlet from the stack of railway timetables he kept upon the corner of his desk, and slip it into his breast pocket. I thought nothing of it at the time. Outside, the sleet had thickened into proper snow, and the streets of London were hushed and white as we made our way in Hargrove's police carriage toward King's Cross Station, where the Northfield Express waited, its engine cold and its secrets sealed, for the arrival of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 2. The Sealed Compartment, in which Holmes and Watson examine the scene of an apparently impossible death, and Holmes makes 3 observations that seem, to Watson, entirely unconnected to the matter at hand. King's Cross, at midnight in winter, has a quality of desolation that few London locations can match. The great arched roof, usually alive with steam and motion and the shouted announcements of departures, was quiet and cold, the platforms lit by gas lamps that threw long, amber shadows across the empty tracks. Platform 7, where the Northfield Express stood waiting, had been cordoned off by 2 constables who stamped their feet against the cold and greeted Inspector Hargrove with visible relief at his return. The train itself was a fine one, the Northern Consolidated Railway's pride, fitted with a Pullman sleeping car of the most modern design. Each compartment a miniature room with folding berths, a small writing table, and the kind of careful appointments that spoke of considerable expense. We were met at the sleeping car's door by Pruitt, the attendant, a thin man in his late 30s with a face that had gone somewhat grey since his discovery of the body. He had the look of a man who had been answering questions for several hours without food or adequate warmth, and I felt a physician's instinct to offer him something restorative. Holmes, however, was already moving past him into the corridor of the car with the focused energy of a hound upon a scent. The corridor of the sleeping car ran along one side, with compartments opening off it at intervals. Cabin 7 was the 4th from the end, the second to last occupied compartment, as it turned out, in a car that had been less than half full on the Edinburgh run. Holmes paused outside the door, which had been left ajar, and studied it carefully before entering, crouching to examine the lock mechanism and the bolt housing on the frame. "The bolt," he murmured, "is of the standard Northern Consolidated pattern, heavy brass, drawing across from the inside. No sign of tampering with the mechanism itself. The wood of the frame is undamaged. The hinges are solid." He stood and looked at Pruitt. "When you used your master key to enter, did you encounter any resistance beyond the normal operation of the lock?" "No, sir," said Pruitt. "But the bolt, sir. I couldn't turn the master key at all at first. Then I realized the bolt was drawn. I had to call the guard, Mr. Simmons, and between us, we managed to get a thin tool, a letter opener of mine, sir, through the small gap at the frame and work the bolt back. Took us a good 5 minutes." "You are certain the bolt was drawn, not merely the lock?" "Certain, Mr. Holmes. I can show you the letter opener with the scratches from the bolt housing, if it would help." "It would help enormously. Please fetch it." While Pruitt went for the letter opener, Holmes entered cabin 7. I followed, and even I, who am not unacquainted with death in its many forms, felt the strange quality of the scene. Cornelius Ashworth sat in the padded armchair beside the small window. The folding berth above him had not been opened, suggesting he had not intended to sleep in the conventional sense, with his hands resting in his lap and his head tilted back slightly against the chair's headrest. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a heavy grey moustache and the ruddy complexion of a man who had spent years outdoors. His evening dress was impeccable: black coat, white waistcoat, white tie, and he wore a diamond stickpin in his cravat that winked in the lamplight. His eyes were closed. If one had not known, one might have thought him merely asleep. I made my examination as Holmes moved about the compartment in his characteristic fashion, not searching randomly, but moving in deliberate patterns, pausing at specific points, occasionally taking out his magnifying glass. I checked the pulse. Absent. And the body was cool. Examined the eyes, the lips, the fingertips. Looked for any sign of convulsion or struggle. There was nothing. The man's hands were relaxed, unclenched. His features were composed. There was no blueness of the lips that might suggest asphyxiation, no redness that might indicate certain poisons. "Time of death?" Holmes asked, without looking up from the table where he was examining the brandy flask. "Difficult to say precisely. The compartment is cold. The heating pipe here appears to have been only partially effective, but I would estimate between 7 and 9 o'clock this evening. No later than 9, certainly. The train left Edinburgh at 9:15, so if my estimate is correct, Mr. Ashworth died very shortly after departure, if not before the train left the station." "Before or after?" Holmes repeated softly, as if filing the distinction somewhere important. He lifted the brandy flask and sniffed it carefully, then set it down without comment. "Holmes," I said, "what do you make of it?" "Three things interest me," he said, "and none of them is the corpse." He pointed in quick succession. "First, that book, there, upon the luggage shelf. It is Mr. Ashworth's, presumably, as it was in the compartment with him, and yet it shows no sign of having been opened. A man settling in for a long overnight journey who has brought a book for company almost invariably reads at least a chapter. The book is perfectly flat, the spine uncracked. Second, the compartment's small waste receptacle, empty, and yet there is a faint smell, beneath the brandy, beneath the cold, of burned paper. Something was burned here, or very recently before boarding. Third, the window latch. He crossed to the window. "The latch is engaged, yes, but observe the exterior of the glass, Watson. Come here." I crossed the compartment and looked where he indicated. The exterior of the window bore a light coating of the sleet that had fallen during the journey, but on the lower left corner of the glass, perhaps an inch above the sill, there was a small, clear arc in the moisture, as though something had pressed against, or perhaps been drawn across, the glass at that point. "What do you make of that?" Holmes asked. I studied it. A smear of some kind, made from outside by the direction of the clear area. Precisely so. From outside, and quite recent. The sleet would have covered it had it been older. Someone pressed something against this window during the journey, Watson. Something narrow and precise, at that specific point. He turned away from the window. "Now, tell me about Mr. Ashworth, Hargrove. Everything." The inspector had been standing in the doorway throughout, and at Holmes's summons, he produced a small notebook. "Cornelius Ashworth, 52 years of age, managing director of the Ashworth Crail Mining Consortium, based in Edinburgh. A wealthy man, very wealthy by all accounts. Married, wife is Lady Eleanor Ashworth, née Pemberton. No children. He was travelling alone on this occasion, bound for London, where he had a meeting scheduled tomorrow morning with his company's solicitors, a firm called Bracewell and Munt. "A meeting with solicitors," Holmes said. "Interesting. On a Friday morning. Do we know the nature of the business?" "Not yet. Find out first thing tomorrow. It is material." Holmes gave the compartment one final comprehensive look, the kind of look that seemed to take in everything and forget nothing. Then, "Pruitt, that letter opener, please." The attendant returned with it, and Holmes examined it briefly under his glass, then passed it to me. The thin blade bore fresh scratches along one side, consistent with having been worked against the inner housing of a bolt. "The bolt was drawn from within," Holmes said quietly, more to himself than to us. "The window was latched from within, and yet something pressed against the glass from without, and a man is dead with no visible cause." He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile so much as a focused one, the smile of a man who has just understood that a puzzle is going to be genuinely worthy of his attention. "Excellent, Watson. I shall need that post-mortem done by morning. Full toxicological analysis, if Dr. Fenwick can manage it. Tell him to look for compounds that would not be apparent on standard examination. Alkaloids, particularly the less common varieties. Hargrove, I need the passenger list for this car. The names and current locations of every person aboard this train tonight. And whatever information your men can gather on Ashworth's movements in Edinburgh during the 48 hours before his departure. Can you manage all of that by 9 tomorrow morning?" "I can try," said Hargrove. "Trying will not suffice," said Holmes pleasantly. "You will need to do rather more than try. 9 o'clock then. Baker Street." He picked up his hat. "Come, Watson. We have much to consider, and rather less time than I should like." Chapter 3. What the Passenger List Revealed, in which Holmes receives several visitors and makes a connection that Watson cannot follow, and a name is mentioned that will prove significant in ways none of them suspect. I did not sleep well that night. The image of Cornelius Ashworth, composed in death in his evening clothes, accompanied me into the small hours, and when I finally did sleep, it was with the uneasy consciousness that something about the scene had been wrong, in a way I could not articulate. Not the wrongness of violence or evident foul play, but a more subtle wrongness, the wrongness of something arranged rather than something suffered. Holmes, as I discovered when I came down at 7:30, had not slept at all. He was at his desk with the Northern Consolidated Railway's public timetable. Not the slim pamphlet he had taken from his stack the previous night, but a more comprehensive volume, heavily annotated in his cramped hand. And spread around him were 3 newspapers, all open to pages I could see at a glance were the financial sections. His pipe had gone cold on the desk beside him, and the fire had burned low, suggesting he had been too absorbed to maintain it. "Coffee, Holmes?" I asked, reaching for the bell. "Already ordered. Sit down, Watson. I want to tell you something and observe your reaction, as it will tell me whether I am thinking clearly or merely wishfully." I sat. "Very well. Ashworth Crail Mining Consortium," he said, without preamble. "I spent an hour last night going through my commonplace books. The name appeared twice, once in connection with a parliamentary inquiry into labour conditions at Scottish collieries 18 months ago. The inquiry found nothing actionable, and once in a financial notice from last October announcing that the consortium had acquired controlling interest in 3 Northumberland iron concerns. Significant acquisitions, the kind that would require rather substantial funds. He tapped the financial newspaper. This morning I found a third reference. Last Wednesday's Edinburgh Courier, which I obtain from the reading room on Mondays in batches. A brief item, barely 4 lines, noting that shares in the Ashworth Crail Consortium had fallen sharply over the preceding week following unspecified regulatory concerns. The share price had dropped nearly 30% in 5 days. "That would be significant," I said. "Catastrophic, for a company that has just leveraged itself to acquire 3 iron concerns." Now, Ashworth was travelling to meet his solicitors the morning after his death, on a Friday. The sort of meeting that is arranged with some urgency, Watson, not a routine quarterly review. You think the meeting was connected to the share collapse? I think the meeting was the share collapse. Or rather, I think Ashworth was travelling to London not merely to meet his solicitors, but to meet someone else as well. Someone whose existence, if known, might explain both the falling shares and the rather alarming urgency of the London visit. He folded his hands. "Now tell me, am I constructing a narrative to fit the facts I have, or following facts to a narrative?" It was the sort of question Holmes rarely asked, and the fact that he was asking it told me something about the quality of his uncertainty. "I think," I said carefully, "that you have a hypothesis, and that you are right to pursue it, but that you are also aware it may be wrong." He nodded. "Precisely so. Which is why what Hargrove tells us this morning will be crucial." The inspector arrived at 9:05, accompanied by a young sergeant named Poole, who carried a leather portfolio of considerable thickness. Behind them, somewhat unexpectedly, came a woman. She was perhaps 40 years of age, tall and composed, dressed in mourning clothes that were clearly newly acquired. The black crepe had the rigid quality of garments bought in haste and worn immediately, without the softening that comes from repeated use. Her face was handsome in the strong, architectural way of certain Scots women, with grey eyes that were very clear and entirely dry. She had, I thought, already done her weeping in private, and was now operating on something colder and more purposeful. "Lady Eleanor Ashworth," said Hargrove, with a slight awkwardness that suggested he had not entirely expected her to insist on accompanying him. "She arrived at Scotland Yard at 8 this morning. I thought, given the circumstances—" "You thought correctly," said Holmes, rising. "Lady Ashworth, please sit down. I am sorry for your loss, and I shall try not to waste your time with unnecessary formalities. Tell me, if you will, when you last saw your husband alive, and what his manner was at that time." Lady Ashworth sat in the armchair with the uprightness of a woman who has been taught, since childhood, that posture is not a luxury but a statement. "Wednesday evening," she said. Her voice was quite steady. "We dined together at home. He left for the station the following morning. Yesterday, on the 10 o'clock train." "Edinburgh Waverley," Holmes said. "Not the 9:15. She looked at him sharply. "The 9:15 from Edinburgh is an overnight express. The 10 o'clock is a daytime service, arriving London at 6 in the evening. He preferred to travel by day." "And yet he was aboard the 9:15, Holmes said. A pause, quite brief but real. "I was informed of that this morning, yes. The inspector tells me he must have changed his plans without telling me. Had he done that before? Changed travel plans without informing you?" "Not frequently, but it was not unknown." "Lady Ashworth," Holmes said, and his voice was gentle but very direct. "Your husband was in Edinburgh on Wednesday evening. He took a different train than the one he had told you he would take, a train that left Edinburgh at 9:15 in the evening rather than the following morning. That train is the fastest Edinburgh to London service, arriving King's Cross before midnight. The daytime service he told you he would take would have arrived London at 6. He would have missed his morning meeting. The 9:15 would have got him there on time, just. I think he changed his plans not casually, but deliberately, and that he did so for a reason he did not share with you. Do you have any idea what that reason might have been?" The grey eyes studied Holmes for a long moment. "My husband," she said at last, "had received a letter on Tuesday. I did not see its contents. He put it away quite quickly when I entered the room, but I noticed that it had an Edinburgh postmark and that the hand upon the envelope was not one I recognised. After he read it, his manner changed. He was distracted, worried, I thought, though he denied it when I asked. He made a telephone call from his study that evening, a long one, and the following morning he told me he was going to London. The original booking, the 10 o'clock daytime train, when was that made? Oh, weeks ago. The solicitors' meeting had been arranged for some time. But the 9:15 booking, the one he actually used, I don't know when he made it. I didn't know he had made it." Holmes nodded slowly. "One more question, Lady Ashworth, and then I will ask you to wait while I speak with Inspector Hargrove. Do you know a man named—" he glanced at one of his newspapers, "Gerald Fenwick Ross?" Something happened in the grey eyes. Not quite fear, not quite recognition. Something more complex. The look of a person who has been shown, unexpectedly, the corner of a thing they had hoped would remain hidden. "The name," she said carefully, "is not unfamiliar to me. But you would prefer not to say more about it." "I would prefer," said Lady Ashworth, "to know why you are asking." "Because," Holmes said, with perfect equanimity, "Gerald Fenwick Ross was also aboard the Northfield Express last night. In cabin 4. Chapter 4. The Other Passengers of the Night. in which the inhabitants of the sleeping car are revealed, and Watson begins to understand that this is a case with several centres rather than one. Sergeant Poole laid out the passenger list upon Holmes's desk with the careful pride of a man who has worked through the night and knows it. Holmes studied it while Hargrove summarised what his constables had managed to learn in the hours since our departure from King's Cross. The sleeping car of the Northfield Express had carried, on the fatal journey, a total of 7 passengers in its 12 available cabins. Holmes arranged the information as follows. Cabin 1, a Mr. Thomas Bradwell, 61, a retired solicitor from Harrogate, travelling to London for a nephew's christening. He had been seen boarding at Edinburgh Waverley, had dined in the restaurant car, and had retired to his cabin by 8 o'clock. The guard, Simmons, had seen his light off before the train reached Berwick. Cabin 3, Miss Dorothea Crane, 38, described on her ticket as a governess. She was travelling to London to take up a new position with a family in Kensington. She had not dined in the restaurant car, having brought her own provisions, and had been quiet throughout the journey. Cabin 4, Mr. Gerald Fenwick Ross, 44, whose occupation was listed as company director. He had dined in the restaurant car and had been seen speaking with Mr. Ashworth. Here I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen, at the bar of the restaurant car at approximately 8:15. They had separated, according to the dining car steward, at approximately 8:45. Cabin 6, a Dr. Rupert Hale, 55, a physician from Glasgow, travelling to present a paper to a medical society. He had dined late, 9 o'clock, and the steward recalled him as a quiet, studious man who had brought papers to read with his meal. Cabin 7, Cornelius Ashworth, deceased. Cabin 9, Mrs. Beatrice Pomfrey, 67, a widow travelling to visit her daughter in Finchley. She had retired very early. Pruitt recalled that her light was off before the train had even cleared the Edinburgh suburbs, and had heard nothing. Cabin 11, a young man who had given his name as Francis Sheldon, 26, described as a student. He had been in the restaurant car most of the evening, running up a modest bill for beer and reading a periodical. He had returned to his cabin, Pruitt thought, around 10 o'clock. 7 passengers, Holmes said, looking up from the list, 3 of whom, Mrs. Pomfrey, Mr. Bradwell, and possibly Miss Crane, were very likely asleep before anything material occurred. That leaves 4 persons of potential interest. Fenwick Ross, who spoke with the victim, Dr. Hale, who is a physician and would know the medical implications of various substances, our young Francis Sheldon, and the victim himself. He paused. Where are these people now? Fenwick Ross took a cab from King's Cross immediately on arrival, said Hargrove. Before we knew there was anything wrong, unfortunately, we have his address. He gave it as 47 Cavendish Street, and Poole has been there this morning. He is at home and has agreed to come in for questioning this afternoon. Good, Dr. Hale? At the Metropole Hotel on Northumberland Avenue, where he had a reservation. He is cooperative, apparently. Very shocked. Sheldon? Hargrove's expression suggested some difficulty. We are having some trouble locating Mr. Sheldon. He gave the address of his college at Oxford, but when we telegraphed, no student of that name is enrolled. A silence, during which Holmes's expression did not change at all, which was itself significant. A false name, he said pleasantly. It would appear so. His description: medium height, medium build, brown hair, clean-shaven, approximately 25 to 28 years of age. Unremarkable in appearance, according to Pruitt. He wore a brown tweed suit and carried a single bag. Holmes turned to Lady Ashworth, who had been listening with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that information is more valuable than grief, at least for the moment. Does that description suggest anyone to you, Lady Ashworth? No, she said. Then, Mr. Holmes, who is Gerald Fenwick Ross, and why does the name mean something to you in connection with my husband's death? "Fenwick Ross," said Holmes, "is the managing director of Northern Consolidated Metals Limited, a company that, until 3 months ago, was the primary rival of your husband's consortium for the Northumberland iron contracts that have since gone to the Ashworth-Crail Consortium. The acquisition of those contracts was, I believe, the source of the sharp rise and subsequent sharp fall in your husband's company's share price. Fenwick Ross lost those contracts. He is not a man who would have taken such a loss lightly. Lady Ashworth absorbed this. You think he killed Cornelius? I think, Holmes said, with careful precision, that he is the most obvious candidate, which makes me rather suspicious of him. He rose and went to the window, looking down at Baker Street and the thin snow that had accumulated overnight on the sill. Obvious candidates in complex situations are either guilty, innocent, or useful. Fenwick Ross may be any of the three. I shall need to speak with him directly before I can say which. And the letter? I asked. The one Ashworth received on Tuesday. That is the pivot on which everything turns, Holmes said, still looking at the window. Someone wrote to Ashworth and changed his plans. Someone caused him to board the 9:15 rather than the morning service. Someone wanted him on that specific train, Watson, which raises the question of who else was on that train by arrangement, and who was there by accident. He turned. Hargrove, your men at Edinburgh Waverley, were there additional passengers who had booked the sleeping car but did not board? Cancellations at the last moment? Hargrove consulted his notebook. 2, as a matter of fact, a Mr. and Mrs. Vincent, who had cabins 8 and 10, sent word to the station master at 5 o'clock that afternoon that they would not be travelling, leaving cabins 8 and 10 empty and Ashworth in the middle. Yes. Convenient, Holmes said softly. Very convenient indeed. He turned from the window with sudden decisiveness. Watson, the post-mortem. Has Fenwick sent his preliminary report? By 9 o'clock, he said. It is 5 past. Telephone his office, would you? The results of that post-mortem will determine what we do next. Chapter 5. The Toxicologist's Evidence, in which science provides an answer, and Holmes receives it with the peculiar satisfaction of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed, but refuses to be satisfied. Dr. Augustus Fenwick, not to be confused with the Fenwick Ross of our investigation, was a precise and methodical pathologist of the old school, who had served Scotland Yard as consulting physician for more than 20 years. When his report arrived, hand-delivered by his assistant at 20 past 9, it was 7 pages of dense, carefully organised clinical observation, followed by 2 pages of conclusions that Holmes read in silence while the rest of us waited, with varying degrees of patience. When he finished, he set the report down on his desk, laid his fingertips upon it, and looked at the ceiling for a full 30 seconds. Well, Hargrove said, unable to contain himself. He was poisoned, I said, having read over Holmes's shoulder. Aconitine, Holmes confirmed. The alkaloid derived from monk's hood, Aconitum napellus. One of the most potent plant-derived toxins known to medicine, Watson. A very small quantity. Fenwick estimates no more than 2 or 3 milligrams. Administered in the right form, in the right concentration, produces exactly what we saw in that compartment. Rapid absorption, followed by cardiac arrhythmia and then cardiac arrest. The victim feels, initially, a tingling or burning in the lips, the tongue, the extremities, then a profound numbness, then nothing. The entire process, depending on the dose and the route of administration, may take between 20 minutes and 2 hours. And the route of administration? I asked, leaning to confirm what I had read. This is the significant part, Holmes said. He tapped the page. Fenwick could find no evidence of aconitine in the stomach contents or the gastrointestinal tract, which effectively rules out ingestion with food or drink. The brandy, Hargrove said. We assumed, you assumed, as any reasonable person would, that if a man is found dead beside a brandy glass, The brandy was the vector. But Fenwick has been thorough. The traces of brandy from the glass, he took a sample from the residue, contained no detectable aconitine. The flask was clean. Holmes paused. Aconitine can also be administered transdermally, through the skin, with a sufficient concentration and a suitable delivery mechanism, a liquid or gel. Absorption through the skin can be rapid and complete. I stared at him. The implications assembled themselves before I had fully chosen to assemble them. "The window," I said. Holmes smiled. "The window, Watson. Very good. The small, clear arc on the lower left corner of the glass. Not a smear, but the trace of something applied to the glass at that exact point. And the window of cabin 7 is a sliding type, Watson. When it is not fully sealed, there is, even with the latch engaged, a very small gap at the lower edge, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, sufficient for a narrow implement to be introduced from without, not sufficient for a hand, but for a thin tube or a rod coated with a preparation." He stood up. "I need to examine that window again, and I need to do it before any more of Hargrove's well-meaning constables go near it." "But the train is at King's Cross," Hargrove said. "Then we must return to King's Cross." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "There is one additional element that Fenwick notes in his report that I find particularly interesting. He estimates, from the distribution of the toxin in the tissue samples and the degree of cardiac muscle degradation, that death occurred at approximately 8:30 to 9 o'clock. The train departed Edinburgh at 9:15. He paused, coat half on. "Do you see the implication?" I thought through it. If he died before 9:15, he may have died before the train moved, or in the very first moments of the journey, which means that whoever administered the poison was either aboard the train before departure, which suggests one of our 6 other passengers, or was on the platform and reached the window of a stationary train, which opens the matter considerably. The train stands at Edinburgh Waverley for how long, Hargrove? 20 minutes boarding time before the 9:15 departure. Scheduled, that is. 20 minutes, a stationary train on a dark platform in winter, a 1/4-inch gap in a sleeping compartment window, a thin tube of concentrated aconitine solution, or a rod coated with an aconitine-based preparation, introduced through the gap and pressed against the skin of a man sitting in the chair beside the window. Holmes's voice was quite calm. It would require precision. It would require knowledge of exactly where the victim would be sitting. It would require that the victim not notice, or that the toxin began to work before he fully registered what had happened. The early symptoms are subtle, a tingling. A man accustomed to occasional numbness from cold, or who had had a drink or two, might dismiss the first sensations. "My God," said Hargrove quietly. "Indeed," said Holmes, "it is a particularly cold-blooded method, not the work of passion, the work of careful planning." He finished putting on his coat. "Let us go and look at that window gap before we theorize any further." Chapter 6. The Man in Cavendish Street, in which Holmes interviews Gerald Fenwick Ross, and Watson observes something that Holmes declines to explain for 3 more chapters. We returned from King's Cross by midday. The window examination had confirmed what Holmes had expected. The gap at the lower left corner of cabin 7's window was sufficient to admit a tube of perhaps 3/16 of an inch in diameter, and the residue on the glass, which Holmes collected with extraordinary care onto a clean piece of chamois leather, was, he was confident, the remains of a thin preparation of oily consistency that had contacted both the glass and, through the gap, perhaps the arm or wrist of whoever sat in the chair. Given that Ashworth had been found with his arms resting in his lap, in a position, Holmes noted, that would have placed the back of his right wrist very near the window if he were sitting naturally in the chair, this was entirely consistent. But it was the interview with Gerald Fenwick Ross that afternoon that shifted the shape of the investigation in ways I had not anticipated. Fenwick Ross came to Scotland Yard at 3 o'clock, accompanied by a solicitor named Carfax who sat beside him and interjected objections with the reflexive frequency of a man paid by the word. Fenwick Ross himself was a surprise. I had constructed, from what Holmes had told me of the Northumberland contracts dispute, a picture of a cold, ruthless financier, perhaps heavy, perhaps florid, the kind of man who ate and drank too well and schemed without compunction. The reality was rather different. He was of medium height and slight build, with a scholar's stoop and dark, intelligent eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles. He was pale, genuinely pale, I thought. Not merely the pallor of sleeplessness, but the kind of pallor that suggests chronic ill health. His hands, when he sat, rested on the table with a slight tremor that I noticed as a physician. "Mr. Fenwick Ross," Holmes began, "you were seen speaking with Mr. Cornelius Ashworth in the restaurant car of the Northfield Express last evening. How long had you known Mr. Ashworth?" "7 years," Fenwick Ross said. His voice was steady, though the hands continued their slight movement. "We were not friends. We were, I suppose competitors would be the accurate term, though competitor implies an equality of scale that had not, in recent years, existed between us. You lost the Northumberland contracts to his consortium. I did. In what I know were, circumstances that were not entirely legitimate." Carfax made a warning noise. Fenwick Ross ignored him. "I am saying only what I have said publicly, Carfax. The parliamentary inquiry found nothing. That is not the same as saying there was nothing to find." "You believe Ashworth bribed someone to secure those contracts?" Holmes asked. "I believe that a civil servant in the Board of Trade named Whitmore received, in September of last year, a country cottage in the Borders in his wife's name, and that the deeds were signed 2 weeks after the contracts were awarded. I have never been able to prove the connection. I was trying, before last night, to prove it." Holmes was quiet for a moment. "You were investigating Ashworth." "I had employed a private inquiry agent to gather evidence, not to harm anyone, to gather evidence that I could take to the proper authorities." "And did you share the fruits of this investigation with Ashworth himself?" The pale eyes met Holmes's steadily. "On the train last night, yes. I told him that I knew about Whitmore, that I had evidence sufficient to present to the authorities. I gave him the opportunity, because, whatever you may think of me, Mr. Holmes, I am not a vindictive man, to come forward himself rather than be exposed." "And his response?" Fenwick Ross was quiet for a moment. He laughed. "He told me that Whitmore had been transferred to a position in the Home Office 6 months ago, and was therefore beyond any practical consequence for anything he had done previously. He told me that my evidence, such as it was, would prove only that a civil servant had received a gift, and that the connection to the contracts would be impossible to establish conclusively. He told me," a pause, "he told me that I should spend my energy in building what remained of my business, rather than chasing shadows." Another pause, and then he stood up, said good evening, and returned to his compartment. "What time was this?" 8:40 perhaps, 45. I went back to my own cabin shortly afterward. I did not see him again. Holmes studied Fenwick Ross in silence for perhaps 10 seconds. "You were not angry?" "A man tells you your years of investigation are futile, dismisses you, and walks away. You felt no anger." Fenwick Ross smiled, and it was a smile with considerable sadness in it. "I felt," he said, "a great deal of anger. I also felt, and this will perhaps surprise you, something like relief. I have spent 2 years pursuing this matter, 2 years in which my business has suffered, my health has suffered." He glanced at his trembling hands with the detached acknowledgement of a man who has made his peace with a physical limitation. "And my family has suffered. When Ashworth laughed and walked away, something in me, the part that had been keeping me going through all of it, simply let go. I returned to my cabin and I slept, Mr. Holmes. I slept better than I have in months. When we left Scotland Yard, I walked beside Holmes for a full block before he spoke. "What did you make of him?" Holmes asked. "He seemed honest," I said, "but honest men can commit crimes if the provocation is sufficient, and his provocation was considerable." "His hands," Holmes said. "Did you observe them clinically? The tremor?" "Yes. It has the quality of essential tremor, or possibly the early signs of Parkinson's syndrome. It would not prevent him from planning something, but it would make certain precise physical actions, such as introducing a thin tube through a quarter-inch gap in a window at a precise location, rather difficult." "Rather difficult," Holmes agreed, "which does not make it impossible, but it is a consideration." He said nothing more for the rest of the walk, and when we reached Baker Street, he went directly to his desk and began writing, with the concentrated ferocity of a man who is in a race with his own thoughts. I noticed, as I settled by the fire, that on the desk beside him lay a small sealed envelope that had not been there before we left. Mrs. Hudson, when I asked, said a young boy had delivered it an hour ago. Holmes had not yet opened it. When I pointed this out, he glanced at it and said, "I know what it contains." It will still contain it in an hour. He was right. When he finally opened it, 2 hours later, it contained a note in a hand he did not recognize, with no return address, reading, "Ask the governess about the letter. She saw who delivered it." Chapter 7. Miss Crane Remembers, in which a quiet woman reveals a quiet observation, and Holmes understands at last the shape of the conspiracy, though he keeps this understanding entirely to himself. Miss Dorothea Crane lived, temporarily, in a boarding house in Bloomsbury, while she awaited the start of her new position in Kensington. Holmes and I found her the following morning, Saturday, in the small sitting room that the boarding house provided for its guests, a plain, spare room that smelled of beeswax and cold. She was sitting at a writing table when we arrived, composing what appeared to be a letter, and she put it face down, with a gesture so quick and automatic that it was clearly habitual, a woman accustomed to privacy. She was precisely as unremarkable as Pruitt had described her, medium height, brown hair worn without particular attention to fashion, a plain face that was, on closer attention, quite striking in its quality of absolute composure. She was the kind of woman who had learned, probably through long experience, to be simultaneously present and invisible, the particular skill of persons in dependent positions who are required to observe everything and comment upon nothing. Holmes explained the nature of our inquiry with unusual directness. He did not, as he sometimes did, approach from an angle. I suspected that he had already concluded that Miss Crane would respond better to honesty than to subtlety. "You were in the sleeping car of the Northfield Express on Thursday evening," he said. "You were in cabin 3. Did you, at any point during the journey, observe anything that seemed unusual?" Miss Crane folded her hands on the writing table. "I wondered," she said, "whether anyone would come to ask me. I considered going to the police myself, but then I thought, I am not certain of what I saw, and a woman in my position, who goes to the police with an uncertain observation, risks her character and gains very little." "Your character is safe with me," Holmes said. "What did you see?" "I saw the man in the brown tweed suit," she said. "The young man who called himself Sheldon." Holmes was very still. "What did you see him do?" "He was on the platform at Edinburgh Waverley before we boarded. I saw him there because I board early. I prefer to be settled before the rush. And the platform was not crowded. He was standing near the sleeping car, about halfway along it, and he had something in his hand. I could not see clearly what it was. A case of some kind, perhaps. Small, like a spectacle case, but longer." She paused. He was looking at the windows, going from window to window, very slowly and deliberately, looking at each one. Then he seemed to find the one he wanted, and he stood there for a moment, and then he got on the train. "Did you see him introduce anything through a window?" "No." I turned away. I was sorting my own boarding ticket, and when I looked again, he was gone. But he was not boarding in the usual sense. He was not, seeking his cabin. He was looking at the outside of the train. Holmes nodded. The anonymous note I received yesterday mentioned that you had seen who delivered the letter to Ashworth. I don't mean the letter in Edinburgh on Tuesday. I mean another letter. One delivered to Ashworth on the train itself, perhaps. Miss Crane looked at him steadily. You have been very well informed, she said. I have a benefactor whose identity I do not yet know, Holmes said. Please continue. At approximately 8 o'clock, Miss Crane said, I stepped out of my cabin to use the washing facilities at the end of the car. In the corridor, I passed the young man in the brown suit, Sheldon or whoever he is. He was coming from the direction of cabin 7, and he was putting something into his jacket pocket. I thought nothing of it at the time, but there was a folded paper in his hand, quite small, like a note, and he looked at me as we passed, and then looked away again very quickly, in the way that people do when they do not want to be remembered. A pause. I am very good at remembering people who do not want to be remembered. It is a professional requirement. After that, Holmes said, Did you see Sheldon again? Once. About 10 o'clock, he passed my cabin door, which was ajar. He was wearing a different coat, a dark one, not the tweed. He was moving quickly toward the end of the car away from the cabins, toward the staff area. The staff area, Holmes repeated, which, on the Northfield Express sleeping car, includes the service door at the rear of the car, I said, remembering the layout from our visit. A service door, Holmes said softly, that opens directly to the outside of the train. His voice was very quiet now. Thank you, Miss Crane. You have been enormously helpful. May I ask, the anonymous note that reached me yesterday, directing me to you, did you send it? She shook her head. I did not. Did you tell anyone about what you had seen? Only one person, the physician, Dr. Hale. He was in the corridor at the same moment I was. We passed each other going opposite directions. He saw Sheldon too, or he saw what I saw, if not with my eyes. Holmes rose. Thank you, he said again. You have been, if I may say so, the most useful witness in this entire case. Not because you saw something dramatic, but because you observed with precision what was actually in front of you, rather than what you expected to see. A pause. I may need to ask you to give a formal statement in due course. Will you be available? I shall be in London for a fortnight, she said. In the street afterward, Holmes walked in silence for half a block and then said, Watson, I know now what happened in cabin 7. I know how, and I am very close to knowing who. What I do not yet know is the full shape of why. There is a dimension to this case that I have not yet fully apprehended. What is it? He shook his head. Not yet. I need to speak with Dr. Hale, and then I need to check something at Company's house. Chapter 8. The Physician's Burden, in which Dr. Hale reveals a connection that reframes everything, and Holmes makes a journey to Company's house that confirms his gravest suspicion. Dr. Rupert Hale received us in his suite at the Metropole Hotel with the nervous graciousness of a man who has been expecting a conversation he is not entirely sure he wants to have. He was a large, soft-spoken man with the careful movements of someone aware of taking up too much space, and his professional manner had a quality of gentle apology about it, as though his very existence were an intrusion on other people's comfort. He had confirmed, before we arrived, that he had indeed seen Sheldon in the corridor at 8 o'clock, but it was what he said next that changed the nature of the case entirely. I recognized him, Dr. Hale said, quietly, when Holmes put the question directly. A pause, during which Holmes and I exchanged a glance. The man who calls himself Francis Sheldon, Holmes said. You knew him, not personally. But I had seen his photograph, in a document, a medical document, that had come to me through somewhat irregular channels. Dr. Hale laced his large fingers together on his knee. I am a physician with, among other specialties, an interest in the treatment of conditions affecting the nervous system. I have, over the past 3 years, been involved peripherally in a set of legal proceedings that I am not at liberty to discuss in detail, but which concerned the administration, or rather the misadministration, of a particular patient's estate during a period of incapacity. Holmes nodded once, encouragingly. The patient's name, Dr. Hale said, was Edmund Ashworth. The name settled into the room like a stone into water. A relation of Cornelius Ashworth, Holmes said. His brother, his younger brother by 12 years. Edmund Ashworth suffered a severe stroke 3 years ago, at the age of 40, from which he has never fully recovered. He is currently residing in a private sanatorium near Stirling. I was consulted regarding his neurological care some 18 months ago, a routine professional consultation, and in that connection I received a packet of material from Edmund's personal solicitor, a man named Currier, who was attempting to establish that Edmund was of unsound mind for purposes of managing his affairs. And in this packet, Holmes said, there was a photograph of the man who calls himself Sheldon. Not as Sheldon. He was identified in the document as Peter Ashworth. Dr. Hale paused to let the name land. Edmund Ashworth's son, age 26, who has been attempting, through his father's solicitor, to contest the management of the Ashworth-Crail Consortium's shares on his father's behalf. Specifically, the manner in which those shares were used in the Northumberland acquisition, without Edmund's consent or knowledge. Holmes was absolutely still for a moment. Then he rose, thanked Dr. Hale with a brevity that betrayed his urgency, and was halfway to the door before I had gathered my hat and coat. "Company's house," he said, when we were in the street. "Now, I should have thought of the shares in Edmund Ashworth's name from the beginning, Watson. That is what the solicitors' meeting was about. That is why the shares fell, not because of regulatory concerns, but because rumours were circulating that a claim was about to be made against the consortium's ownership structure. Edmund Ashworth holds 22% of the consortium's shares, held in trust during his incapacity, but not transferred and not voted away. If a competent court determined that the Northumberland acquisition was made using resources that included shares from Edmund's trust without proper authorization, the acquisition could be unwound. Cornelius Ashworth was going to London to meet his solicitors because Peter Ashworth, Edmund's son, had finally found a legal route to challenge him, and so Cornelius Ashworth had to die before that meeting took place, I said. Before the meeting, or before the legal challenge could be formally filed. The meeting with Bracewell and Munt was almost certainly to arrange a preemptive response to the challenge. With Cornelius dead, Holmes left it there. The records at Company's house confirmed what Holmes had suspected. Edmund Ashworth's 22% stake in the Ashworth-Crail Consortium was held in a trust administered by, and here Holmes became very still as he read, Lady Eleanor Ashworth, appointed as trustee by Cornelius Ashworth 18 months ago, at the very moment when Peter Ashworth's legal challenge had first appeared on the horizon. Lady Ashworth controlled Edmund's shares, and Lady Ashworth would, as the widow of the sole remaining active director, also now control the entirety of her late husband's stake. Chapter 9. The Second Death That Did Not Happen, in which Holmes receives an urgent telegram and a trap is nearly sprung before its time, and Watson experiences a moment of genuine fear. We return to Baker Street to find a telegram waiting on the hall table, delivered while we were at Company's house. Holmes read it standing in the hallway, still wearing his coat, and his expression shifted in a way that I had learned, over long years, to interpret as meaning that circumstances had moved faster than he had anticipated. "What is it?" I asked. "Peter Ashworth," he said, handing me the telegram. It was from Hargrove, sent at 2 in the afternoon. Sheldon, identified as Peter Ashworth, son of Edmund Ashworth, found this morning boarding ship at Tilbury. Detained for questioning, requesting your presence, Hargrove. He was leaving the country, I said. He was leaving the country, Holmes confirmed, which is what an innocent man does when he realizes he is about to be implicated in his uncle's murder, and what a guilty man does when he realizes the net is closing. He paused. The difficulty, Watson, is that I do not yet know which he is. We were at Scotland Yard by 4:30. Peter Ashworth, for so he had confirmed himself to be, when the pretence of the false name was no longer tenable, sat in the interview room with the quiet desperation of a young man who has run out of options and knows it. He was, as Pruitt had described Sheldon, unremarkable in appearance. Brown-haired, clean-shaven, with intelligent eyes that were red-rimmed from what might have been either exhaustion or weeping. He had, by the time we arrived, already been questioned by Hargrove for 2 hours, and he had said, according to the inspector's notes, essentially nothing useful. Holmes sat down across from him without preamble and said, "Your father is Edmund Ashworth. He is at Glenmuir Sanatorium near Stirling. You have been trying to protect his interests. You were on that train to confront your uncle and to give him the opportunity, the same opportunity that Fenwick Ross gave him earlier in the evening, to step back from the legal challenge before it went to court. Am I correct?" Peter Ashworth stared at him. "How am I correct?" A long pause. Then, "Yes. Did you kill your uncle?" "No." "Did you introduce a preparation of aconitine into his compartment through the window of his cabin while the train stood at Edinburgh Waverley?" The young man went white. "Aconitine? Was he was poisoned. Did you do it?" "No." The word came with a force that was either genuine horror or very good acting. "God, no. I went to his compartment that evening to speak to him. I knocked. He opened the door and saw it was me, and he shut it again without a word. That was the only contact I had with him. I spent the rest of the evening trying to decide whether to knock again, and failing to do so." His voice dropped. "I'm a coward, Mr. Holmes. I have been a coward about this since the beginning. My father is ill. His brother has been exploiting him for years, using his shares, blocking his recovery, because a recovered Edmund would be a legal complication, controlling the trustee arrangement so that my father's money goes where Cornelius directed it, not where my father would direct it. I knew all of this. I had documentation. I was on the train to tell Cornelius that the documentation was going to a judge on Monday morning. That was all. And then he was dead and I panicked and I ran." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "The item in your hand when Miss Crane saw you in the corridor at 8 o'clock. You were putting something into your jacket pocket." "The note I had written him," Peter Ashworth said. "I had slipped it under his door before dinner, telling him I was on the train and asking him to speak with me. He ignored it. Later I thought, if I were found with a note that identified me to a man who was murdered that evening, I destroyed it. I burned it in my wash basin." Holmes nodded slowly. "You were seen, later in the evening, in a dark coat, moving toward the service area at the rear of the car." Peter flushed. Yes. I was trying to find out whether there was some way to... I was trying to find out if there was a way to get off the train and rebook. I couldn't face arriving in London with his body on the same train. I wasn't thinking clearly." He looked at his hands. "I am an idiot. I know I am an idiot." Holmes rose. "You are not, as it happens, the most significant person in this case," he said. "You are, however, the most honest one I have yet spoken with, which makes you simultaneously both useful and in danger." He paused at the door. "Hargrove, keep him here tonight. Not for his guilt, but for his safety." Outside the interview room, Holmes leaned against the wall for a moment with his eyes closed. I waited. "Watson," he said, without opening his eyes, "when we spoke to Lady Ashworth on Saturday morning, she said her husband had received a letter on Tuesday that changed his behaviour. She said she did not see who delivered it. She said she did not recognize the hand on the envelope." "Yes." "She lied," Holmes said, and opened his eyes. "She did not lie about seeing who delivered the letter. She lied about not recognizing the hand, because the hand on that envelope was her own." Chapter 10. The Widow's Architecture, in which Holmes reconstructs the conspiracy from its foundation, and Watson begins to see what has been hidden in plain sight throughout. It was Sunday evening before Holmes would speak at length. He had spent the intervening period in a state of concentrated, almost ferocious thought, barely eating, barely sleeping, occasionally descending upon his chemical apparatus for what I suspected were less experiments than displacement activities, the physical motions of a man whose mind is the true instrument at work. I had my own thread to follow. On Sunday morning I had gone, at Holmes's quiet suggestion, to visit Dr. Fenwick again at his laboratory. Holmes had given me 3 specific questions to ask, and the answers to all 3 had confirmed what Holmes suspected about the mechanism of the poisoning, particularly regarding the concentration of aconitine preparation required to produce transdermal delivery through a 1/4-inch gap at the distance between the window gap and a man's resting wrist. It would require a preparation, Fenwick had told me, of unusual potency, not something that could be purchased or even easily compounded without significant chemical knowledge. The preparation must be oil-based to ensure skin penetration and concentrated to perhaps 50 times the standard medicinal preparation, itself already a lethal quantity. This is not the work of an amateur. Someone with genuine chemical or pharmaceutical training prepared this substance. On Sunday afternoon, Holmes sent 3 telegrams and received 2 replies. He showed me neither the telegrams nor the replies, but after reading the second reply, he said, "It is worse than I thought, Watson, and more elegant." He did not elaborate. At 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, he finally sat down opposite me, with a fresh pipe and the look of a man who has decided that the architecture is sound enough to be displayed. Lady Eleanor Ashworth, he said, was born Eleanor Pemberton, the 4th daughter of Lord Pemberton of Inverness. The Pemberton family, at the time of her marriage to Cornelius Ashworth 21 years ago, was in considerable financial difficulty, a situation that the marriage was intended to resolve. It did resolve it, initially. But Lady Ashworth is not, Watson, a woman who was content with the resolution of her family's difficulty alone. She is a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable ambition, who found herself, over the course of 20 years, in a marriage where her husband's regard for her had diminished progressively, and where her own influence over the business affairs she had helped, in the early years, to build, was steadily eroded as her husband brought in other advisers and other associates. "You have spoken to people who know her," I said. "I have spoken to 3 people who worked with the consortium in various capacities and whose observations of the domestic and professional situation accord with one another in ways that suggest truth rather than coordination. Lady Ashworth, 18 months ago, was appointed trustee of Edmund Ashworth's shares, nominally at her husband's direction, but I am now confident that the suggestion originated with her, because the trustee of those shares, Watson, controls a 22% stake that, combined with her potential inheritance of her husband's holdings upon his death, would give the trustee effective control of the Ashworth-Crail consortium. She planned to inherit, I said slowly, and with the Edmund trusteeship in place, she would be the controlling interest, not a widow of modest means with a courtesy title and a house she might have to sell, but the de facto owner of one of the most significant mining consortiums in Scotland. Holmes drew on his pipe. Now add to this the following. Lady Ashworth, before her marriage, was educated, unusually, for a woman of her class and era, at the Inverness Ladies' Scientific Institute, where she studied natural philosophy and chemistry with some distinction. I have confirmed this with the Institute's records. I absorbed this. The aconitine preparation. A woman with genuine chemical training, access to her husband's considerable resources, and a motive of significant magnitude, Holmes said. She wrote the letter to her husband on Tuesday, the one that changed his plans. The letter was designed, I believe, to tell him something that would cause him to take the night train rather than the morning one, to give him information that made Thursday morning's meeting suddenly seem urgent rather than routine. Perhaps she told him that Peter Ashworth's legal challenge was further advanced than he knew. Perhaps she warned him of some development that required his immediate presence in London. The content was chosen to ensure he was on a specific train, the 9:15, on a specific night. And then she arranged for the Vincents not to travel, I said. Or she was the Vincents. Or arranged for a person acting as an agent to book and cancel the adjacent cabins, ensuring that cabin 7 was isolated on both sides. He set down his pipe. The mechanism was, I believe, prepared in advance and delivered to someone on the platform at Edinburgh Waverley. Or she was on the platform herself, Watson. Someone who knew exactly which window was cabin 7, who knew that Ashworth would be sitting in the chair beside the window, because that is the most natural position for a man alone in a sleeping compartment, and who possessed a prepared device, a long thin tube or rod, coated or filled with an aconitine preparation, designed to be introduced through the gap in the window and held against the occupant's wrist or hand for the few seconds necessary for absorption to begin. But the timing, I said, to kill him before the train left the station. She did not need to kill him before the train left the station. She needed to begin the process before, or very shortly after, departure, at a time when her own whereabouts could be accounted for. He looked at me steadily. Watson, where was Lady Ashworth on Thursday evening? I realized I did not know. At a dinner party, Holmes said, in Edinburgh, given by the Earl of Marchmont. 20 guests. She arrived at 7:30 and departed at 11. This is established, documented, and irrefutable. He paused, which is, of course, precisely why she arranged it so carefully. Then she had an accomplice on the platform, I said. She had an accomplice on the platform, Holmes confirmed. Or she was the agent herself, briefly, between arriving at the Waverley station to see her husband off, a perfectly natural thing for a wife to do, and proceeding to the Marchmont dinner. A quarter of an hour between the two, perhaps. Enough time. He rose. But I cannot prove this yet, Watson. Not definitively. I can demonstrate motive, means, and opportunity. What I cannot yet demonstrate is the specific mechanism of commission, the physical evidence that connects Lady Ashworth or her specific agent to the preparation and delivery of the aconitine. He turned to the window. Which means I must set a trap. Chapter 11. The trap is baited, in which Holmes conceals his knowledge and deploys Watson as an unwitting instrument. And a particular kind of theatre begins on Baker Street. Holmes's trap, when he described it to me on Monday morning, was elegant in the way that his best stratagems always were, not elaborate for the sake of elaboration, but precisely calibrated to exploit the specific weaknesses of a specific mind. Lady Eleanor Ashworth was, he had concluded, a woman of exceptional intelligence and exceptional self-control. She would not be unnerved by direct accusation. She would meet it with composure and a solicitor. She would not be panicked by evidence of which she was already aware. She had, presumably, already disposed of any direct physical evidence in her own possession. What she could not easily defend against was information she did not know he had, specifically, information about the one element of the plan that had not gone precisely as intended. Peter Ashworth. Peter Ashworth had been on the train. Peter Ashworth had seen his uncle on the night of his death. Peter Ashworth had burned a note in his wash basin, a note that, in the chemistry of the cramped space, might have left trace evidence. Peter Ashworth was alive, detained, and talking. And Peter Ashworth could, if he chose to, provide information about the legal challenge against the consortium, information that, in court, would be material to the question of motive. Holmes's plan required, first, that Lady Ashworth know, incorrectly, that Peter Ashworth had told Holmes something specific and damning about her involvement, and second, that she have a reason to attempt a second act of self-protection that Holmes could observe and intercept. The instrument of the first requirement was a carefully worded letter, signed by Holmes, which he sent to Lady Ashworth on Monday morning. I read it before it went. Dear Lady Ashworth, I write to inform you that Peter Ashworth, currently detained at Scotland Yard pending inquiry, has provided information regarding communications between yourself and your late husband on the subject of the Northumberland acquisition and the Edmund Ashworth trusteeship. I would be grateful if you could call upon me at Baker Street at your earliest convenience to address certain questions that have arisen from this information. I remain, yours faithfully, Sherlock Holmes. This is deceptive, I said. Peter Ashworth told you no such thing. Peter Ashworth told me a great deal, Holmes said, the net effect of which is what I have described. The letter is constructed to suggest more than it states. A careful reader will note that it does not claim Peter Ashworth made specific accusations, only that he provided information, and that questions have arisen. Lady Ashworth, however, will not read it carefully. She will read it in the way that a guilty person always reads such a letter, looking for what it reveals of the writer's knowledge rather than what it actually says. And the second requirement? She will wish to contact someone, her solicitor certainly, but also, and this is the critical part, she will wish to contact the person who assisted her on the platform at Edinburgh Waverley, because if Peter Ashworth has communicated something specific, that person's identity may be at risk. She will need to warn them, or to arrange for their departure, or to coordinate a story. He looked at me. I have arranged for Hargrove to have Baker Street watched. Anyone who leaves with Lady Ashworth, or who she contacts after leaving here, will be followed. You think she will come. She will come because refusing to come, with Scotland Yard already involved, is not in the character of the woman I have spoken to. She will come, and she will be composed, and she will probe me very gently for the extent of my knowledge, and she will leave with the impression that I know more than I do, which will be enough. Lady Ashworth arrived at Baker Street on Monday afternoon, at 3 o'clock precisely. She was dressed again in mourning, but something in her bearing had changed since Saturday. A degree of tension beneath the composure, perceptible only to those who had seen her without it. She accepted tea. She sat in the client's chair with the same architectural uprightness. Holmes spoke for 20 minutes, leading her carefully through a reconstruction of the case's facts as he presented them, somewhat altered from their actual disposition, emphasizing Peter Ashworth's testimony, which Holmes generously augmented, somewhat understating the window evidence, and entirely omitting his knowledge of her chemistry education. Lady Ashworth listened, responded, deflected, and asked questions. And in asking those questions, she revealed, without realizing it, the precise shape of what she feared. She asked twice about Peter Ashworth's specific words. She did not ask about the window. She did not ask about the aconitine. These were the things she believed she had covered. What she had not anticipated was Peter. When she left at 4 o'clock, Holmes was at the window within seconds, watching the street below. I was beside him. A cab came and she entered it. A moment later, a second man, who had been, I now noticed, waiting in a doorway across the street for the full hour of Lady Ashworth's visit, hailed another cab and followed. Hargrove's man, Holmes said. Good. He stepped back from the window. Now we wait. Chapter 12. The Agent Revealed, in which the follower follows, and what he finds at the end of the trail connects two threads that Holmes had seen as one for some days. We waited 3 hours. Holmes occupied the time with his violin, playing without particular attention to the music, the sort of absent, ruminative playing that meant he was thinking hard about something and did not wish to be interrupted. I read and ate the supper Mrs. Hudson brought at 6:30, and tried not to watch the clock. Hargrove arrived at 7:15. He was accompanied by Sergeant Poole and, somewhat to my surprise, a third man, small, neat, in a plain dark overcoat, whom Hargrove introduced as Inspector Munro of the Edinburgh City Police, who had arrived in London that afternoon and had been brought, at Holmes's advance request, directly to Baker Street. Munro had the unhurried, dry competence of a man who has seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He shook hands with Holmes with a quiet respect that suggested he was not entirely unacquainted with Holmes's reputation. She went, Hargrove said without preamble. To a pharmacy in Holborn, Brentwood's, on Museum Street. She went inside. She was there for approximately 25 minutes. When she left, my man noted that she was carrying a small package that she had not had when she entered. He set his notebook on Holmes's desk. My man waited, then went inside and spoke to the pharmacist, a man named Collard, who was, initially, reluctant to say anything. However, when my man produced his warrant card and explained the nature of the matter, Collard became somewhat more forthcoming. Collard, Holmes said. Collard. Yes. Do you know him? I know of him. He is, or was, a pharmacist of considerable skill who lost his registration 4 years ago following an inquiry into the supply of certain controlled substances to persons who subsequently came to harm. He operates, as I understand it, as a consultant of sorts to those who require pharmaceutical preparations that are not available through legitimate channels. Holmes looked at Munro. Inspector, do you recognize the name? Munro nodded. In Edinburgh, before he lost his registration, Collard operated a pharmacy on the Canongate. We questioned him 3 years ago in connection with a suspicious death. We could not establish enough to charge him. He moved to London shortly after. The pieces assembled. Holmes said, Lady Ashworth knew Collard from Edinburgh. She commissioned the preparation from him, the aconitine compound. When she received my letter this afternoon suggesting that Peter Ashworth's testimony had implicated someone specific, she went to Collard, either to retrieve any remaining evidence of the preparation, to warn him, or to obtain something further. He turned to Hargrove. What did Collard tell your man? That Lady Ashworth had collected a standing order, his phrase, and that everything pertaining to it was now settled. He said this rather too firmly, which my man took as a sign that he was trying to close the matter. Hargrove paused. He also said, after some persuasion, that a preparation had been supplied some weeks ago to a woman of the description of Lady Ashworth, that it was an oil-based compound of a type used, in small quantities, in certain external medical applications, and that he had no knowledge of any unusual chemicals being involved. He knew perfectly well what was involved, Holmes said, but he will be difficult to prosecute for it. The preparation is gone. A pause. Unless, he turned to me with sudden alertness. Watson, the chamois leather with the residue from cabin 7's window, where did I put it? Your desk, I said, knowing his system. 3rd drawer on the left, in the tin that also contains your tobacco ash samples. He crossed to the desk, found the tin, and extracted the chamois leather, sealed in a small glass vial. He held it up to the lamp. The faint oily smear was still visible. Fenwick, he said. We need Fenwick to compare this residue to whatever preparation Lady Ashworth collected from Collard today, and to any residue that can be found at the pharmacy itself. He looked at Munro. Inspector, you have, I believe, the ability to request a search of that premises under the Edinburgh precedent. Munro smiled thinly. I do, and I shall. He rose. There is one more thing, Mr. Holmes. When Lady Ashworth left Brentwood's pharmacy, she was followed by Sergeant Poole for another 40 minutes. She made one additional stop. He nodded to Poole. She went to a telegraph office on Southampton Row, Poole said. She sent 2 telegrams. We were not able to read the messages, but we noted the addresses. One was to a legal firm in Edinburgh, Currier and Associates, which I understand is the solicitors who represent Edmund Ashworth's interests. A silence. And the second? Holmes asked. The second was to Glenmuir Sanatorium, near Stirling, addressed to the medical superintendent. Holmes stood very still. Watson, he said quietly. Edmund Ashworth. Is he in danger? I thought through what I knew of aconitine, of oil-based preparations, of the length of telegrams and the time available. If she has sent instructions to someone at the sanatorium, and if that someone has access to the patient, yes, potentially. Holmes was already at the door. Hargrove. A telegram to the Stirlingshire Constabulary, immediately. They must send men to Glenmuir Sanatorium tonight and ensure that Edmund Ashworth is under police protection until further notice. Munro, will you telegraph the Edinburgh City Police for the same purpose as backup? Both men moved at once. Holmes turned to me with an expression I rarely saw on his face, a genuine urgency that was very close to fear. I should have anticipated this, he said. Edmund Ashworth is the last obstacle to her complete control of the consortium. With Cornelius dead and Peter discredited, Edmund is the only person whose recovery would undo everything she has built. I should have. He stopped himself. There is no utility in recrimination. Come, Watson. We have a great deal to do before morning. Chapter 13. The Night Express to Edinburgh, in which Holmes travels north and Watson is left in London to manage two threads of an investigation that is now moving very fast in both cities simultaneously. Holmes took the night train to Edinburgh at 9:15 that evening, with what private irony I did not know, carrying Munro's letter of introduction and the full weight of what he now knew. He left me with 3 specific tasks and the assurance that he would telegraph from Edinburgh by 6 in the morning. My tasks were as follows. First, to take the residue sample from cabin 7's window to Dr. Fenwick that night and instruct him to begin a chemical comparison with any samples Hargrove's men could obtain from Brentwood's pharmacy. Second, to obtain from Company's house, first thing in the morning, the specific documentation regarding Edmund Ashworth's trust, particularly any amendments or modifications made to the trust documents in the last 18 months. Third, to be at Scotland Yard at 7 in the morning to be present when Lady Eleanor Ashworth was brought in for formal questioning. The first task occupied me until midnight. Fenwick was not pleased to be roused, but he was professional in his response once I explained the urgency, and he set his assistant to working immediately on the sample while I returned to Baker Street. The Company's house task revealed, on Tuesday morning, that the trust documents for Edmund Ashworth's shares had been amended 12 months ago to include a provision that, in the event of Edmund Ashworth's death during the period of incapacity, his shares would transfer not to his son Peter, as the original trust had stipulated, but to the trustee, Lady Eleanor Ashworth, for a period of 5 years, for the purposes of maintaining the stability of the consortium's operations. The amendment had been signed by Edmund Ashworth himself, but the signature bore a quality that I noted with some unease. Edmund Ashworth had suffered a severe stroke. His signing hand would not be steady. The signature on the amendment was, to my non-expert eye, rather too steady for a man recovering from a stroke. I noted this and brought the document to Hargrove. The third task, the interview at Scotland Yard, was, in its way, the strangest experience of the entire case. Lady Ashworth arrived, accompanied by a solicitor whose name was Hatfield and whose fees were clearly at the top of the London market. She was composed, she was cooperative. She answered questions for 3 hours, with the careful precision of a woman who has prepared for this moment and prepared thoroughly. She denied knowledge of the aconitine preparation. She denied knowledge of Collard. She explained her visit to Brentwood's pharmacy as the collection of a personal medication, a sleeping preparation she had used for some months, for which Collard, despite his lack of formal registration, was the only pharmacist she trusted, having known him in Edinburgh. She explained the telegram to the sanatorium as concern for her brother-in-law's welfare, expressed in the shock of her bereavement. She expressed every appropriate emotion at appropriate moments. Hatfield intervened exactly as often as necessary, no more. It was exactly as Holmes had predicted. She would not be unnerved by accusation. She would meet everything with composure, and without the chemical evidence Fenwick was analysing, and without whatever Holmes had gone north to find, there was not, at that moment, sufficient evidence to hold her. Hargrove let her go at 11 o'clock. She left with Hatfield, and I watched them from the window of the inspector's office with the uncomfortable feeling that we had, perhaps, pushed her too soon. Holmes's telegram arrived at 12:15. It was characteristically brief. Edmund Ashworth safe. Sanatorium staff member suspended pending inquiry. Amendment to trust documents confirmed as forgery by Edinburgh handwriting expert. Returning tonight. Do not move without me. S.H. Chapter 14. The complete account, in which Holmes returns and lays out, before Watson, Hargrove, and Lady Ashworth herself, the entire architecture of the crime, leaving nothing unexplained and nowhere for the truth to hide. Holmes returned on the midday train on Wednesday and came directly to Baker Street, where he consumed a very large breakfast and then slept for 4 hours. I did not disturb him. The case, as I now understood it, was very nearly complete. The remaining question was not one of evidence but of presentation, and Holmes, I knew from long experience, would present it in his own way and in his own time. At 5 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, he convened what he called, with mild irony, a small gathering, in the sitting-room at Baker Street. Present were Inspector Hargrove, Sergeant Poole, Inspector Munro, who had returned from Edinburgh bearing a sealed evidence bag, Dr. Fenwick, Lady Eleanor Ashworth, and her solicitor Hatfield, and, somewhat to everyone's evident surprise, Peter Ashworth, pale but upright, and Dr. Rupert Hale, who had been asked to attend as a medical witness. Holmes stood by the fireplace. He did not sit. He spoke for nearly an hour, and I shall render his account as faithfully as I can, though no written record can quite capture the peculiar authority of Holmes in this mode, the clean, unhurried precision of his reasoning, the way he built each element upon the last with the inevitability of mathematics, the occasional pause that was not uncertainty, but the deliberate withholding of the next piece until the last had been fully absorbed. "I shall begin," he said, "not with the crime itself, but with its design, because what is most remarkable about this case is not the cleverness of the execution, but the patience and intelligence of the planning. This was not a crime of passion. It was not improvised. It was built over a period of at least 18 months, with the care of an architect who understands that every element must support every other element, and that a single failure anywhere in the structure will bring the whole thing down." He paused. Lady Ashworth sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Holmes. Her expression was entirely unreadable. Cornelius Ashworth controlled a significant mining consortium. His wife, Lady Eleanor, had been, in the early years of their marriage, a genuine partner in building that business, a contribution that was progressively diminished and finally rendered invisible as the business succeeded and her husband's regard for her diminished with it. She was an intelligent woman in a position that made no use of her intelligence. She was a woman of ambition in a situation that provided no outlet for ambition, and she was aware, because she was the kind of woman who pays attention to such things, that her husband's younger brother Edmund, who held 22% of the consortium's shares, was both incapacitated and, in the event of his death, positioned to leave his estate to his son Peter rather than to the consortium's principal beneficiaries. He outlined the trust arrangement, the original terms, the amended version, the forgery. As he spoke, I watched Peter Ashworth's face move through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, anger, and then something like grief for his father. Dr. Hale, beside him, placed a hand briefly on the young man's arm. "The forged amendment," Holmes continued, "was designed to ensure that Edmund Ashworth's shares, upon his death, would come under Lady Ashworth's permanent control. But Edmund did not oblige by dying. He has survived 3 years of incapacity, and his son Peter, who is rather more tenacious than Lady Ashworth had anticipated, has been pursuing a legal challenge that threatened to unwind not only the trust amendment, but the Northumberland acquisition itself." Holmes turned slightly to address the room more broadly. "It was this legal challenge that forced the timeline. Lady Ashworth learned, through means I have not been able to establish, but which I suspect involved an informant within Peter Ashworth's legal team, that the challenge was close to being formally filed, and that a judge was prepared to grant an emergency injunction. She needed to act before the filing, which would have triggered scrutiny of the trust documents and the consortium's acquisition records. The method was explained in clinical detail: the approach to Collard, the preparation of the aconitine compound, the use of her access to Cornelius's travel arrangements to choose the specific train, the careful removal of the adjacent cabin's occupants, the arrangement of an agent on the Edinburgh-Waverley platform, and here Holmes looked directly at Hargrove. "I believe the agent on the platform is a man currently known as Harold Sims, who was employed as a casual porter at Edinburgh-Waverley on Thursday evening and who has been identified by Inspector Munro from Waverley's staffing records." Munro. Munro opened his evidence bag and produced a photograph. Hargrove leaned forward to look and nodded. Sims was a laboratory assistant who worked for Lady Ashworth's family in Inverness some 15 years ago, when she was conducting her own chemical studies. He has since drifted through various occupations. He was arrested last evening in Leith, in possession of a sum of money that significantly exceeds what a casual porter might be expected to earn, and certain communications which, once decoded, they being in a simple substitution cipher, contain instructions consistent with what I have described. He paused. Sims, when confronted with this evidence, elected to make a full statement. "It is in Munro's possession." Hatfield intervened. "My client, your client," Holmes said, without altering his tone, "is in considerable difficulty, Mr. Hatfield." "Hargrove, Dr. Fenwick's report." Fenwick stood. He was brief and technical. The residue from cabin 7's window was an oil-based preparation containing aconitine at a concentration of approximately 48 times standard pharmaceutical strength. The residue obtained from a test tube found in Brentwood's pharmacy, overlooked in the confusion of the police visit, and subsequently identified by Collard when offered, as Fenwick put it, certain incentives, matched in chemical composition to a very high degree of confidence. Collard had made a second statement confirming that the preparation had been commissioned specifically, that he had been told it was for pest control, and that he had been paid £50 in cash by a woman of Lady Ashworth's description. There was a long silence. Lady Eleanor Ashworth looked at Holmes for a moment that seemed to last rather longer than it was. Then she turned to Hatfield and said, in a voice that was almost entirely steady, "I think, Hatfield, that you had better earn your fee." It was not a confession. It would never be, precisely, a spoken confession. But it was, as Holmes told me afterward, the moment at which the case was over. Everything that followed, the formal arrest, the charging, the transfer of the case to the Crown prosecutors, was procedure rather than investigation. The investigation was complete. Chapter 15. The letters that were never sent in, which the aftermath is described, and Holmes discovers one final element of the case that troubles him more than all the rest. Lady Eleanor Ashworth was formally charged with the murder of Cornelius Ashworth and with conspiracy in the preparation and commission of the act. Harold Sims, the platform agent, was charged as an accessory. Collard, the pharmacist, faced charges relating to the manufacture and supply of a controlled substance in circumstances leading to death. The forged trust document was referred to a separate proceeding. Peter Ashworth retained a solicitor of his own choosing and began the process of contesting the amendment on his father's behalf. Edmund Ashworth remained at Glenmuir Sanatorium under improved supervision, and I was told, some months later, that his condition had shown a modest improvement. Whether this was medical progress or simply the removal of a malign influence from his circumstances, I could not say. But it was not these developments that stayed in my mind in the weeks following the conclusion of the case. It was something Holmes showed me on the Thursday afternoon after Lady Ashworth's arrest, a collection of papers that had been found, during the search of her Edinburgh home, in a locked drawer of her writing desk. They were letters, 16 of them, dated over a period of 6 years, all in the same careful feminine hand, addressed to various persons. A solicitor who had subsequently retired, a member of Parliament who had since died, a senior official at the Board of Trade. Each letter was a careful, specific, intelligent account of what Lady Ashworth believed to be evidence of corruption, mismanagement, and exploitation within the Ashworth-Crail Consortium. Not of Edmund specifically, but of the consortium's broader practices, including the Whitmore matter that Fenwick Ross had also been pursuing. Not one of the letters had been sent. Each was completed, signed, and then, apparently, withdrawn and retained. Holmes spent some time with these letters after he found them. I watched him read each one in sequence, and when he had finished he set them down and said nothing for several minutes. "She tried," I said at last, because someone had to say it. "She tried," Holmes confirmed. "For 6 years she tried to address what she knew through legitimate means, and each time, at the last moment, she pulled back, whether from fear, or from a calculation that it would not succeed, or from some other reason I cannot determine. She did not send the letters." He paused, and then, when it became clear that the legitimate path was closed, she chose the other one. "Does it change anything?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "It changes nothing about what she did, and whether she must answer for it," he said. "It changes nothing about Cornelius Ashworth, who is dead. It changes perhaps something about how one understands the dimensions of the tragedy. That this was not a woman who was always monstrous, but a woman who became monstrous when every other avenue had failed her." He set the letters on the desk with a precision that suggested he was also setting aside the reflection they prompted. But that is not, properly speaking, a detective's domain. It is a philosopher's, or a clergyman's, or yours, Watson, if you choose to think about it. I have thought about it in the time since. I have no satisfying answer. Chapter 16. Baker Street in February, in which Holmes makes a philosophical remark and turns his attention, as is his custom, immediately to whatever comes next. It was a Saturday evening, perhaps a fortnight after the conclusion of the Ashworth case, and we were in Baker Street in the way that had always seemed to me the natural state of things. Holmes in his armchair with his pipe, myself opposite him with a book I had been attempting to read for some weeks without making significant progress. The winter outside was doing what winter in London always does, providing a uniformly grey and damp commentary on human ambition. Hargrove had sent a note that afternoon, informing us that the trial date for Lady Ashworth had been set for the spring, that the Crown prosecutors were confident of conviction, and that the Company's House investigation into the trust document forgery had expanded to implicate 2 additional parties whose names he was not yet at liberty to share. The Ashworth-Crail Consortium, in the meantime, was under the management of a court-appointed administrator, while the ownership questions were resolved, and its shares, after weeks of volatility, had stabilized at roughly their pre-acquisition value. Peter Ashworth had sent a brief note of thanks that was, Holmes told me, the kind of note that a man writes when he has genuine cause for gratitude but is too English to be comfortable expressing it. 3 careful sentences that meant rather more than they said. Gerald Fenwick Ross had sent nothing, which Holmes had observed was characteristic of a man in whom pride and relief exist in difficult cohabitation. "Holmes," I said, setting down my book, "do you suppose she would have been convicted through the legitimate channels? Lady Ashworth? If she had sent those letters?" He considered this with genuine seriousness, drawing slowly on his pipe. "The Whitmore matter, the corruption in the contracts? Possibly. Not certainly. Whitmore was protected by his position. Cornelius was protected by his money. The system does not, as Lady Ashworth clearly concluded after 6 years of effort, punish the powerful with any reliable regularity." A pause. "The question you are really asking is whether her conclusion was right. I suppose it is. She was right that the letters would likely have achieved very little. She was right that the letters would likely have achieved very little. She was wrong that this made the alternative a reasonable choice. He looked at the fire. The deficiency of legitimate channels is an argument for improving legitimate channels, Watson. It is never, logically, an argument for murder. But logic is not the primary organ of human decision-making, and persons who reach their conclusions after 6 years of rational effort and rational failure tend to arrive at irrational ends. It is a melancholy case, I said. It is the most human kind of case, Holmes replied. The ones that engage me most fully are rarely those in which the criminal is simply wicked. Wickedness without complexity is merely pathology. This, a person of genuine intelligence and genuine grievance, who chose, at a particular moment, the wrong means for a perhaps not entirely wrong end. This is the kind of case that reminds one that criminal investigation is, at its root, not the study of crime, but the study of people. He paused. Which is, I suppose, why it never becomes boring. He rose and went to the window, looking down at Baker Street with the expression of a man who is, simultaneously, satisfied with what has just concluded and restless for what has not yet begun. The gas lamps were lit against the early February dark, and a thin sleet had begun again to fall. "There is a letter," he said, not turning around, "that arrived this morning and which I have not yet opened. I can see from here that it is postmarked Bristol, that the sender uses a peculiar green ink that is sold by only 3 stationers in the country, and that the weight of it suggests the inclusion of a photograph or a newspaper cutting. Mrs. Hudson put it on the mantelpiece. I looked. There it was, a pale envelope with a Bristol postmark. "You haven't opened it?" I said. "I have been enjoying the anticipation," Holmes said. "There is something to be said for not knowing. One knows so quickly, and then the knowing becomes merely facts, and the possibility is gone." He turned from the window. "But I think the time for anticipation is about over." A slight smile. "Shall we, Watson?" He crossed to the mantelpiece and took up the letter with the ease of a man reaching for something that already belongs to him, and in the comfortable gas-lit warmth of our Baker Street sitting room, with the sleet on the windows and the fire in the grate, he opened it, and the next case, whatever it might be, began. Thus concludes Sherlock Holmes and the Dead Man in Cabin 7, narrated as faithfully as my pen allows. John H. Watson, M.D. The End.